the relentless pursuit of the elimination of waste. Everybody comes in and does whatever they can to do that. But when you're organizing something that's a little more formal, like an improvement event, you do want somebody leading it, and there is somebody who's going to be responsible for making sure that they track all the progress and that you track the data. You absolutely need to know what your data is going to be, what's your goal, and then who's going to be responsible for tracking that and managing that.
From the basement to the boardroom, from ideas to innovation, you're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are pushing the sterile processing industry forward. Each week, you'll encounter diverse perspectives from subject matter experts across the country and around the globe. Frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal to help you fight dirty. Every instrument, every time. Whether you are tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. Now, turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go Beyond Clean.
This week on Beyond Clean, we speak with Dr. Rachel Mandel, a physician executive with over 30 years of clinical, teaching, and physician executive leadership experience. In her consulting work, she focuses on healthcare transformation through process improvement, population health, and patient experience. She has a green belt in Lean Six Sigma and is committed to assisting organizations on their journey to high reliability, especially during these complex and challenging times. Dr. Mandel is the senior healthcare advisor for Operational Performance Solutions, a well-regarded national lean consulting company. She is a healthcare whisperer. And Hank, I love that we record these intros after the interview, because when you have a great tagline like Dr. Mandel is a healthcare whisperer, I already know she in fact is. Her passion for lean process is really about to come out very strong in this interview, and I just can't wait to get into it, and I know the listeners are going to appreciate just how much pride she takes in this work.
I totally agree, Justin. And one of my personal reasons for looking forward to this particular interview is because I've had some interactions online and on LinkedIn in particular in regards to lean methodology and its application to sterile processing. And I am not by any means a lean guru or anything like that. And in fact, I've kind of been the one, pushing back saying, well, yeah, let's think about it from this perspective. Let's look at it this way. So I'm looking forward to learning more about the philosophy itself, hearing a couple of applications in the sterile processing context, and hopefully, again, setting the stage for more conversations in the future around a topic that's just not going to go away.
All right, well, we'll be right back with Dr. Rachel Mandel after a short break.
You're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
We are speaking with Dr. Rachel Mandel, Senior Healthcare Advisor for Operational Performance Solutions. And Dr. Mandel, I'll tell you, we've had plenty of references on prior podcasts to lean process and process improvement as a result of Kaizen events, which you're going to go into on this episode. But I don't think we've ever really taken a deep dive into what lean is and then what does it actually look like in a department. And I know of at least two sterile processing departments across the country that have gone through a process of doing lean at their facilities and had some pretty outstanding results from that. So I think it's great that you're joining us today and being able to share your expertise on the matter.
Thank you, Justin. That's why I'm here.
Excellent. So why don't we just start by doing some basic definitions of lean concepts. I threw out a couple of buzzwords there. There may be plenty of people that had no idea what I was saying. And quite frankly, I only have a very surface level understanding of what I'm referencing. So why don't you give us some of the definitions and set a baseline for the conversation?
Sure. So lean is a evidence-based methodology that's geared towards process improvement or continuous improvement or any type of processes that you have in an organization like a hospital that you want to make better. There's tools, there's tips, there's philosophies, but all of it is tied together with this phrase lean that we use so that people have the same frame of reference when they talk about what they're doing and what they want to do.
So it's bigger than just an event, right? So that's what I'm hearing from you now. It's not just something that you put on the calendar and, the date comes around, everybody does it, and then you walk away and said, hey, we just did lean, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's a little more meat on the bone there.
Yeah, there's a lot more meat on the bone. And that's one of the misconceptions about lean. Of course, those types of events are part of lean, but it's really a culture change. It's a way for an entire organization to be relentless about process improvement and continuous improvement, to come to work every day looking for those little changes that will make a difference in somebody's life, especially in a hospital or especially in sterile processing, where what you do truly is impacting somebody's health and well-being.
Can you go over, just for the folks in the audience who maybe they have been exposed a little bit more to this conversation, or at least they've been in the room as some of these terms have been discussed. Can you go over some of those key words, that are often used in conjunction with this culture, as you mentioned, that could use some defining, and hopefully, like, some of the words sound foreign, at least to American ears, because many of them are coming, from another language, obviously, as well. Some of them are acronyms, some of them are translations or transliterations, from other languages. So if you were to boil down, a few of those big keywords that have been confused or maybe just have misconceptions in the industry to what they are, what would you say those big ones are?
I actually don't want to answer that question.
Okay, great.
Because I'll be honest with you, I think that some of the terminology and some of the lingo, jargon, and language has been a barrier to the acceptance of lean, especially in healthcare and in the United States. I think that using language and words that sound foreign or you can't define them just by hearing them has definitely been an obstacle. So I would prefer, to tell you the truth, to stay away from some of those and to really discuss lean in a way that is accessible to everybody and makes sense to people when they hear us talking about it.
All right, you're speaking my language. Because,
Okay.
if we can boil it down to someone who doesn't know anything about what this conversation is about and still walk away with an understanding of the heart of it, and to your point earlier again, the philosophy, what is this trying to accomplish, not only in the process, but also with the people, that's great. I love that non-answer, okay? No fight here on that. So, if you watch the news, though, and if you have conversations with hospital administrators, the idea of lean is pretty in vogue now, at least in healthcare. Can you comment on why that is, or even if you agree with that statement?
Yeah, I wish it was more in vogue, to tell you the truth. I think that there is so much opportunity in healthcare for process improvement. The thing about lean is that it's a focus on identifying waste in a system or in a process and then removing that waste so that you can really get to the crux of the job that you do and you can improve your quality. And there is just so much waste in healthcare. There's just so many opportunities. And when we look at how much of our gross domestic product we spend on healthcare and then how much of that could be waste, and estimates are anywhere between 30 and 50% of what we spend is wasted, then you really understand why we should be using more process improvement like lean, but we don't.
So do you think it's because people are afraid of something? Are there some fears that generally arise when somebody hears that term?
I do. I think there's probably a couple of levels. One is people they're overwhelmed, and especially now, they're just so overwhelmed and they're so busy and they just don't feel like they've got the time to address one more thing that is not right in front of them. I think that it's hard for organizations from the top all the way through the entire organization to accept or support a culture change like this. And then if we back off to like the really kind of concrete thing, people just step back and they go, well, this comes out of Toyota and patients are not cars.
Oh, that's interesting. I have not heard that. And while I understand it, I think one thing that, especially I've seen this in supply chain, and I talk about this quite frequently actually, but I've seen many supply chain organizations go outside of the healthcare industry specifically for that reason. Let's bring experience from aerospace and, from auto manufacturing. What have they figured out about the supply chain that we have not? And I get that. People say it doesn't really translate. It's different here. And there is an element of truth that healthcare is very much its own beast, and because we are dealing with human lives. But I think also something that you just said that really resonates to me, and especially as people continue to have a squeeze put on them, right? There's been a lot of changes in reimbursement as a result of the Accountable Care Act, and patients who are readmitted with a surgical site infection, it winds up costing the hospital more. And there's a couple of different ways to attack what that means for an organization. One is lean, and I'm going to bring that back to you in a second. But another way is to start squeezing cost, FTEs. And so it isn't very uncommon for me to hear people say, you know what, we really like X solution, but we just don't have time to do that right now because we're so busy with everything else and we're downstaffed, or we don't have the numbers to take on such a big project. That's not just applying to lean. I've seen that in hospitals across the country where there's obvious technology improvements, but they're like, we just can't handle the transition right now. It's too much of a heavy lift. And that really resonates to me. I don't know if you have anything to follow on that.
Sure. Actually, it makes me think about two things, what you just said. The first is that it is another challenge and a barrier when people think about efficiency. And I don't like to use that word when I talk about lean, because immediately the hair on the back of people's necks go up because they think, oh, we're going to do this efficiency project and then we're going to downsize. That's not what lean's about. That's absolutely not what lean is about. So lean is about getting the waste out so that you can concentrate on what you need to do so that everybody can do their job more effectively. You can really spend time with the patients. You can spend time concentrating on getting those instruments clean. You can spend time on doing the processing. You can spend time in the operating room. I mean, that's really what lean is meant to do. It's not meant to get rid of people or to cut back on staffing. It may control costs, but who doesn't like controlling costs?
Yeah, and you're really tasked with having to do that. And it's funny, something that you just said about letting the team members solve the problems. That's something that our chief medical officer, Dr. Peter Nickel, talks about in his presentations all the time, is the people that are doing the work know the answers to what they need. And we need to listen to them. And I think that you were just getting to that just now as you were describing some of the misconceptions that often come up in these departments, and not just sterile processing, but in any department in really any industry when they hear lean.
Right. And they have this idea about lean. See, the second thing I was going to say was that I think that the fact that patients are not cars is actually a benefit, because a car can't talk to you. A car can't tell you if something is working or if a process is helpful to them or not, because lean is all about value. You want to see what's value added to your process. And that has to do with the stakeholder. That's the patient. That's the person who's the customer. So if you're doing something that doesn't add value to the process, to that customer, it's worthless. Get rid of it. Now, there's some things you have to do that are non-value but necessary, regulations and things of that nature. But there's so much waste, you can get rid of it. And if the patient can tell you what those things are and what's working for them and not working for them, that's much easier than a car that doesn't talk to you. So I think there is value in healthcare, and saying that a patient is not a car, I think that that's a good thing. As it relates to the staff, yes, the people who do the work, the front lines, they're the ones who really should be the most engaged in a lean process improvement event. They're the ones who know what's going on. They're the ones who are going to follow through on that improvement. They're the ones who have to sustain that improvement. They're the ones who, after you put your first improvement in, are going to come back and say, you know, this works pretty good, but it could be better. You can't dictate to somebody what they need to do. I mean, you can, but they're not going to sustain it. You can have an executive or somebody else come in and say, you have to do it this way. And maybe the staff would do it that way for a short period of time. But if they're not engaged, if they're not invested, you're not going to be able to sustain the change.
It all comes back to that question of culture. If you're asking for transparent communication, from the frontline staff, how has this change impacted the system, and getting that, feedback that is potentially not positive feedback, right? So this is asking our technicians, sometimes to tell us hard things that, hey, this idea, is not working. It's actually slowing us down, or it's actually creating confusion through the workflow. And you're right, I can see this playing out in a department context where there is perhaps a lack of trust or a lack of transparency in the culture, that regardless of the planning and the implementation of the lean improvement or project, all of that will crumble or at least falter if it's being done in an atmosphere where no one trusts each other and no one likes each other, right? Isn't that a common problem, I would assume?
It is, and this issue about culture is a really important one. People like the concept of not having a blame culture. Healthcare is notorious for potentially having a blame culture. It's somebody's fault. Lean doesn't take that approach. That's one of the philosophies that I really like about it. The philosophy is whatever happened, it wasn't a person. You can't blame a person. The process was broken. Okay, the process might have allowed something to happen that we didn't want to happen. Do we really think that people come to work in the morning and they want to do a bad job? Of course not. So if something happens that's not a good outcome, there's a process that was broken that we need to deal with. And you can't blame people. You shouldn't blame people, because what's going to happen is exactly what you said. They're not going to come forward with improvements. They're not going to talk about what happened. You're not going to get down to the root cause. That's one of those phrases, okay, root cause of what happened. This is kind of the key thing. I mean, we should probably talk a little bit about some of these problem-solving processes or some of the tools that you can use in Lean, that although they're tools, they're part of this bigger culture of not blaming somebody, but looking at those processes and getting waste out of the process and streamlining them so you can get better quality, decrease your defects.
It's so interesting that you say that, because I don't think I really ever had heard or understood that the focus was on the process. I mean, I understood that you might map some things out and you were definitely evaluating the process, but I don't think I understood the key part of what you just said, which is how you build that trust and get that engagement and the long-term follow through and the open and honest dialogue, like Hank was saying, is by focusing on that other party, that third party that's not really in the room, which is the process. And I can tell you, I've always done that. And I live in Pennsylvania, and there's a funny saying of the Philadelphia 76ers as they tried to rebuild their roster. They said, trust the process, trust the process. And it was a big joke. And I'm a Celtics fan, so I definitely always laughed at trust the process. It was kind of a joke in the Celtics fan base. But I will tell you that every time in a region where I've managed sales and operations, it's a very similar dynamic between sales and ops. They don't always get along. They don't have the same perspectives. And, sales will sell something and then ops might say, but we can't do that. And so the way that they work together, at least when I've built teams, has been to build a process where it forces them together and have conversations. And exactly what you just described is how I would deal with conflict. I'd say, no, this is our process. You have this perspective. You have this perspective. We agreed that this is how we would work together on it. There's a gap. We missed something. So let's close the gap and let's focus on fixing that. And it helps keep that moving forward. Is that also what you're describing?
There's so much there that you just said that we could unpack around this. So one, what you're talking about is you're talking about standard work. So standard work, and that's one of those phrases that people don't like because it makes them think cookbook. It's not cookbook at all. Standard work means you've got the people who come together, who do this every day, write down and codify. They formalize in some way. What do they do? What is the evidence-based way to do it? And they all agree to this process to do something like processing of endoscopes. Okay, so they all agree that this is the way to do it. Of course, there are certain guidelines and regulations and all of that gets put into the pot. But then somewhere along the way, they decide that there's a better way to do it. They fix the process. They change the standard work. But when you've got standard work, they all know what they're supposed to do. They all know the right way to do it to get the best outcomes. They know why they're doing it, which is really important. You can't just tell somebody to do it. You've got to explain to them why they're doing it and the importance of what they're doing. So that's standard work, and that's part of Lean. Then there's that value stream analysis, looking at the workflow. What are they all doing? And that's when everybody comes together and they put their 2 cents in. What's your piece? What's your piece? And you get those aha moments of, I didn't know you did that. Why do you do that? I do that too. Why do we both do that? Do we really need to both do that? It's really a fascinating process. And that's part of Lean also. But it's that making of that team that you referenced.
So Dr. Mandel, let's bring this in deeper to some sterile processing and surgical application here. So we've laid out a couple of tools. You talked about the culture of Lean, the purpose of it, and the broader concept of healthcare, and your preference that it would be more of a rage than it is.
Yes.
To reduce waste and capitalize on the opportunities here. So from your experience in the field in sterile processing and surgery, can you flesh out what this actually looks like? Because I know we're going to have folks listening to this interview thinking, okay, I get it, that all sounds great, but I still don't see a concrete example of how this would work out in my department, even if I wanted it to. So can you outline a couple of those examples, just make it real for us?
Sure. So when you're talking about lean, you're talking about waste. And there are 7 basic categories of waste, which we won't go into right now, but one of them is waiting. None of us like to wait, but that's a waste. It's a waste of time. So when you think about a sterile processing department, is there ever any waiting? Of course there is. They may be waiting for case carts to come from the operating room. You may be waiting for something to be steam sterilized. You may be waiting for somebody to come who's going to get a piece of equipment. You may be waiting for a vendor pack to come in. There's a lot of waiting. These are all processes that are not working if anybody's waiting. So you take a look at that process, and everybody who's involved in that process will break it down into its pieces and then determine that's your current situation, that's your current state or condition. And then you put together, you brainstorm what your perfect or future condition is. What should it look like? And then you put together an implementation plan. And this is part of the problem solving that really, I'm being very superficial about it. But then you put an implementation plan in, is what do you have to do to get from your current state to the way you want it to be, that is a better way to work your process. And that can be a short fix for something, or that could take a couple of weeks, or that could take 6 months, depending on the intensity of what has to be done to fix the problem that you're looking at. We can take a look at another example. Another waste is overproduction. In sterile processing, as a surgeon, when I think about overproduction, I think about those trays that come to the OR table full of instruments, 90% of which I'm never going to touch. So what happens to those instruments is they go back to sterile processing, and they all have to get processed, even though I didn't touch them. They've been opened. So that's a broken process, right? Those sterile processing techs are wasting their time processing instruments that weren't used, that never needed to be in that case cart to start with. But nobody's taken a look at that process of understanding what surgery is being done, what do you need. You get into surgeon preference cards. That's a whole nother issue, but it's important.
Right. So from the perspective then of these projects, because you talked to the beginning, right, of this is my phrase, not yours, but this is a democratic process. We've got a lot of folks at the table engaged in the project, but from the execution part of this, so let's say, the folks hearing that, because I know there's a lot of folks who just heard what you just said and say, oh yeah, we got some wasteful trays that need to be optimized, right? And so they're like, okay, I'm sold. Who is all involved in the execution of this, right? So the planning and the operations part of it, is it typically the sterile processing manager that is the project lead? Is it someone from the outside of the department but still in the facility, or someone from outside the facility completely? What does that look like in the field?
There's a lot of different ways to approach it. Typically what an organization will do is they'll probably bring somebody in from the outside who will not only help start some of these evaluations and some of these projects, but will also train people in lean. They'll do a basic course because everybody really has to speak the same language. So they'll get the basic training so they understand what's going on and what they need to do, and they'll understand the tools and the methodologies. And then you can train up some more people to be leaders and to be facilitators within the organization. There are organizations that are completely lean in terms of process improvement. You mentioned a few previously across the country who do this, and they have whole departments where people are trained and certified in lean, and they will lead these projects. But really everybody's involved. And the phrase is the relentless pursuit of the elimination of waste. Everybody comes in and does whatever they can to do that. But when you're organizing something that's a little more formal, like an improvement event, you do want somebody leading it, and there is somebody who's going to be responsible for making sure that they track all the progress and that you track the data. You absolutely need to know what your data is going to be, what's your goal, and then who's going to be responsible for tracking that and managing that. So there's a lot of different ways to approach it, but ultimately what you really want is you want the organization to be self-sustaining, that they've got the capability within themselves to do this on their own eventually, and that they become a continuous improvement culture that is operationally excellent. They don't need anybody from the outside to help them with it, that they can self-sustain.
I love that phrase, the relentless pursuit, right? Like that's the story. And ultimately, if you look at this from the standpoint of a technician and a leader, and I think you may have even answered part of this question at least, on why everyone in the sterile processing department should pursue some type of lean training for or with their teams. And you've alluded to some of these. And although you didn't say this, the natural implication of reducing waste in a funny way also protects and saves jobs, right? Because if you're reducing costs And that means that you're doing so in a way that's not having to save money through reducing a head count, right?
Correct.
So if you're saving supplies, or you're saving processor time, and that means that you're saving coworkers. And as a sterile processing manager, I love that. And I know as a technician, I would have loved that too, because that means more people in Deacontown to help me on the busy days. Heck yes, I'm going to look for waste in all the other places I can until there is no more waste to be found in this entire department. If that means I get more people to help me do the job. So what other reasons maybe that we haven't covered, or how would you summarize that primary focus for folks in our industry in sterile processing, from the brand new technician all the way up to the sterile processing seasoned director, to pursue these concepts further, to dig deeper, to learn more?
So there's a lot of literature out there, of course. They probably got resources in their own hospitals, because every hospital does have some process improvement in it, and they just need to tap those resources. It comes down to be honest, it's kind of simple. It's looking around and trying to look with fresh eyes. It's something that you do every day, and then thinking about how you could do it better. Again, you look at those pain points, those things that when you come into work in the morning, you say, I can't believe that I have to do this again. Why do I have to do this again? Why is this happening again? You even mentioned on those really busy days when you're scrambling because, you've got all these cases. Well, the question is, why is it like that? Why isn't there a steady workflow? What is it about the schedule of cases that's impacting your workflow like that, where you don't feel like you've got the staff to manage it? Because when people are scrambling, that's when mistakes get made, because the process gets kind of circumvented or the process is not working. So do they need to change the schedule in the way cases are scheduled? They need to what's called level load them so that it's smoother and you're not getting these big surges and getting these downtimes and quiet times. Are you processing your equipment quickly enough or efficiently enough so that there's enough instruments and case carts available for certain cases, even if there's emergencies, so that you don't have to flash them? Because, we don't want to do flashing. We'd rather not do that in terms of processing our instruments if we don't have to. There's just so many opportunities that people who are working in sterile processing every day see. They just have to start thinking about it, because everybody's got their nose to the grindstone. They're all working hard. This is that investment in the time, right? I don't have time for this. We touched on that early on. I don't have time for this, but this is one of those things where if you invest the time now, it will save you so much time and money later. Wouldn't you love to go to your supervisor and say, look, we've become so good at this. Not only are we doing this more efficiently and effectively, but we have decreased the cost. We have less broken instruments, we have less reprocessing, we're not steam sterilizing, as much. And because of all of that, we don't have to have a traveler. So look how much money we're saving because we're so good at what we do. Wouldn't you love to take that to your supervisor and have them take it to their VP or their director and then go up the chain of command and say, look what we did?
Dr. Mandel, this has been, I think, a really important interview and empowering, and your passion 100% coming across. I know you've seen it change departments, probably even change lives and attitudes. That new buzzword that you gave me, continuous improvement culture, that's my new favorite. I'm going to be using it a ton, and I feel a hashtag continuous improvement culture coming from Hank on a LinkedIn post coming soon to a LinkedIn feed near you. But I just want to thank you for coming on, sharing your insights. It's clear that you're doing really great work here. Otherwise, you just wouldn't get this excited about it. You are a phenomenal guest.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. As you know, I love talking about it.
That was Dr. Rachel Mandel, Senior Healthcare Advisor for Operational Performance Solutions and Hank. This is the second episode, and there's only been 2 so far in season 10, where we've talked such a great deal about culture and departmental culture and interdepartmental culture. But I think the biggest thing, and it's a strategy I've used that I didn't realize at all was part of Lean, but focusing on the process and dehumanizing the issues or removing that blame game or that blame culture like Dr. Mandel was talking about, it's so critical to maintaining a positive focus and trying to take what we're doing in this industry forward. But there's another piece that I think is really important, because sometimes people are like, yeah, everybody who's always positive like that all the time, they're full of it. I don't believe anything that they say. They're, used car salesmen with their just positive attitude every day. And I haven't even had my coffee yet, right? But there's this other side where what this process does, different from what I've kind of used to focus on the process, what Lean appears to me to do is that it opens up productive conversations about the issues. so that you can stay positive, but also be genuine and real, that you are happy and that you realize that there's fulfillment in fixing the issues instead of coming into the same ones day after day.
I think, Justin, that Dr. Mandel is a great advocate for how lean should work, right? And how the concept should be understood and how it should be implemented. Because the folks out there who have had experiences with lean and they have not been positive, I think this interview will give a little context for, perhaps that experience wasn't the bad things about lean, but just lean done incorrectly. Or, it wasn't lean at all, right? Maybe it had the name, but it wasn't the undergirded philosophy of the culture piece, as you said, and the trust and the engagement of the frontline staff. Maybe it was some kind of top-down approach and they were calling it by a name, but that's not in reality what it was. So I learned a lot in this episode, as I alluded to in the interview, that I don't know a lot about lean. I've heard the concepts. I have not been afraid of it by any means, but it's been nice to hear a little bit more and have it contextualized in sterile processing and in surgery. And like I said as well, the idea that you can reduce waste and protect the jobs of your coworkers, because then it's not their head on the chopping block. It's, hey, let's reduce this overproduction, this waste in the surgical tray. No one cares if we get rid of the Kelly clamp, but I've got a problem getting rid of Kelly on second shift. So let's find other places to get rid of waste through some lean concepts.
All right, Hank. Well, I agree. It's so important that it's done correctly so that people have a positive experience with it. And I definitely think good leadership has a lot to do with it. And you can tell Dr. Mandel is a good leader. So by the time this episode releases, she will have spoken at one of the 3M conferences that we're partnering to put on, as well as having done a webinar with Census. And so I don't know if you have any additional details on that, but if anybody wants to get a little bit deeper into this discussion, they can definitely visit beyondclean.net. Hank, anything to add there?
Yeah, the Census webinars are all available through the YouTube and the Facebook pages as well. And then, as you said, all the conference materials will be through the website beyondclean.net.
All right, well, that's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support Beyond Clean by subscribing on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify, or by downloading our smartphone application for iPhone and Android. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to our show. And if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, just send an email to info@beyondclean.net. On behalf of Hank and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean.